May 16, 1940, Washington, D.C. A single promise ricochets across the chamber: 50,000 airplanes a year. Not better airplanes. More airplanes, relentless, replaceable on time. It sounds like heresy to craftsmen who worship perfect tolerances, but the battlefield will not grade beauty. It will count arrivals. The new arithmetic is brutal throughput over flourish fixtures, over virtuoso hands, rail priority over romance. If war is a machine, the winning gear is rate. And rate is built, not wished. In that moment, America chooses quantity as a weapon, cold, disciplined, scalable, and the sky, not the drawing board, becomes the judge. Across the ocean, confidence is carved in steel. The Axis doctrine exalts quality as identity: hand-fitted bearings, knife-edged supercharger impellers, airframes massaged by masters whose names never appear on manifests. Perfection is the point. Production is the afterthought. A fuselage moves station to station, like a sculpture, files gauges, blue chalk, and patient wrists. Engines are jewels. Assembly lines are galleries. Output inevitably crawls. Schedules bend around craftsmen instead of fixtures. Jigs exist, but they serve artisans rather than command them. Changeovers stall. Rework hides in pride. Tack time is whatever the foreman can plead from a tired crew. Subcontractors multiply parts, not interchangeability. The philosophy feels invincible in the showroom and vulnerable in a storm. Every loss at the front must be replaced by something rare. The factories wear a myth: quality conquers quantity, that worked when margins were small and time elastic. But war compresses time. It punishes waiting. It rewards sameness that fits the first-time ships the first day, bolts the first try. The Axis believes excellence is a property of hands. America is about to show it can be a property of systems. Precision without pace will become a beautiful way to lose. Begin at the workbench. The tool tray is immaculate: feeler gauges, lapping plates, jeweler's files, micrometers that read in hairs of a millimeter. A crankcase half for a V12 lies like an altarpiece. Two men debate a tolerance stack, not with a schedule in mind, but with a philosophy: nothing leaves this station unless it is as perfect as a watch. Now widen the frame. Multiply that instinct by an entire industry, and you understand why the Axis laughed at America's 50,000. They were not only mocking the number, they were defending a creed. Complexity felt like proof of seriousness. A single power plant might hide dozens of bespoke fasteners. Its supercharger impeller was knife-edged and hand-balanced, each blade a minor sculpture. Carburation ignition oil scavenged their pathways, braided through castings that required artistry to machine and patience to assemble. Access panels were few. Service demanded contortion. On paper, the gains were elegant: a few kilograms saved by trimming wall thickness, a few horsepower added by exquisite port polishing. The price was invisible at first hours, thousands of them disappearing into the gaps between almost and exact. Costs followed the shape of the parts. Complicated forgings require complicated dies. Special steels require special furnaces. Hand-fitting requires hands that cannot be everywhere at once. Prototype logic leaked into production, and pilot build never quite ended. Jigs existed, but they complemented artisanal skill rather than commanding it. A fuselage traveled like a piece of art from cell to cell. If a mating surface fought back, a file appeared. If a harness was short by 2 fingers, someone lengthened it on the spot and promised to update the drawing later. Later rarely arrived. Time stretched. Changeovers punished lines that were lines in name only. Variant creep, new subtypes, field mods, block changes, fractured economies of scale. Inspection queues ballooned because inspection still behaved like an adversary, not a partner in design. Rework hid inside pride. The more a station struggled, the more its operators believed only they could save the part. Meanwhile, bottlenecks migrated like ghosts today: the heat treat oven, tomorrow the gun pack, the day after a shortage of a seal that only one supplier in Swabia could deliver. Quantity bowed to the shrine of quality. Peak outputs plateaued not because there weren't enough buildings, but because every additional unit demanded the same intensity of attention as the last. Training a replacement took months because skill lived in wrists and habits, not in fixtures and visual controls. The supply chain mirrored the shop floor, too many unique parts, chasing too few machines, too many drawings with too many exceptions, too many approvals for too many minute changes. Every success at the front, every celebrated aircraft or armored fighting vehicle was a reminder of how high the bar had been set for the next copy. When America announced rates an order of magnitude beyond the comfortable, the response in certain offices was derision. They will drown in their own crudity. That sentence contained an assumption that quality and quantity were opposites. It also contained a miscalculation that complexity scales. It does not. Complexity replicates costs and delays with uncanny fidelity. A design that craves virtuosity at each station will starve when fed to an army of new workers. A process that requires exceptions will collapse under the weight of volume. And a doctrine that mistakes precision for throughput will discover that on the battlefield, the enemy counts airplanes, not microns. By the time the laughter faded, the ledger had spoken. Unit cost curves refused to bend. Takt times refused to stabilize. Scrap quietly devoured weeks, and even when a masterpiece emerged from the far wall, fast lethal, admired it did so at the expense of the next one waiting behind it. The joke was never on America's number. The joke, cruelly, was on the belief that you could win a modern war with rare things. America's problem was blunt. The war demanded weapons now in volumes that would shatter any craft-first system, and those weapons had to be reliable on arrival. Not merely good. Good enough again and again delivered on a clock that ignored weather and sentiment. The Army Air Forces did the math: sorties, losses, training pipelines, spares consumption, depot capacity. The curve that mattered was not top speed. It was replacement tempo. If the front burned through 20 bombers today, the nation had to breathe in, and hours later breathe out, 25 crewable, serviceable with parts that fit the first time. That was the untold problem, not how to build the best airplane, but how to build the next airplane without failing the schedule. The answer began with a heresy in certain circles and a sacrament in others' mass production. Translate aviation into Detroit. Reduce artistry to geometry. Move knowledge from wrists into fixtures, from foremen's heads, into process sheets, from comforting myths, into measurable steps. The path required design to bow to manufacture. If a bracket took 5 setups, change the bracket. If a harness fouled a rib at Station 27, reroute it on a board and freeze the pattern. If a mechanic's reach exceeded safe posture, roll the job to a rotisserie jig that presents the work to the worker, not the worker to the work. Standardize, then modularize. Define interchangeability as a military requirement, not a courtesy. Number every hole pattern, lock torque values, publish inspection gauges with go/no-go logic anyone can read after 1 hour of training. Build harness boards so a 19-year-old can string a complex loom without ever touching the aircraft. Pre-stuff fuselage sections so pipefitters, electricians, and riggers do their tasks in parallel, not in each other's laps. Put every subassembly on a schedule that ties to rail priority codes. Crate things to stack. Label things to fly. Time itself became a tool. Time motion studies, once caricatured as stopwatches and clipboards, exposed waste, not as moral failure, but as physics: reach, bend, hunt, wait. Visual controls shouted when a station starved or a bin went dry. Changeovers were rehearsed like theater. Preventive maintenance lived on wall charts. First-time fit was not a boast, but a KPI on a chalkboard no one wanted to erase. And when a defect appeared, the fix traveled forward into design, not sideways into a heroic patch. The supply base learned new grammar. Instead of 10 suppliers making 10 similar parts, 2 made 1 standard part each, at twice the rate, guarded by statistical control so variation stayed inside the rails. Heat treat lots carried histories. Gauge R&R, the unglamorous science of whether a measurement means what it says, kept inspection from lying. Contracts rewarded delivery as much as brilliance. Drawings lost romance and gained revision discipline. Every exception demanded a death certificate. None of this mattered if the last mile broke. So railroads earned priority windows. Ports learned to breathe cargo in tempo. Trucks arrived at docks with manifests that matched the far station's hunger. Depots turned into synchronizers, not museums. The miracle was not the glamorous shot of a sparkling bomber rolling out. It was the unfilmed fact that another rolled out behind it, and another, without the line drowning in its own cleverness. Reliability rode in on this tide. When parts are truly interchangeable, maintenance becomes arithmetic. Swap torque, sign fly. Meantime, between failure climbs not only because designs improve, but because assembly variability falls, and service procedures are the same from Arizona to Norfolk. Training compresses because the job is the process sheet. A new worker can become a productive worker fast because the fixtures do the remembering. Mass production did not erase quality, it redefined it. Quality became meets spec at rate. The spec was ruthless about what mattered: strength, alignment, flow, safety, and indifferent to flourishes the front would never see. The philosophy cut against pride, and it saved lives. In the end, the only persuasive argument was empirical squadrons stood up on time. Attrition curves bent. Depots stopped cannibalizing hangar queens. And those gaping rectangles at the far wall of the factory filled with airplanes at a pace that made mockery feel very small. America did not discover a shortcut. It built a system. And systems, once they start to run, are hard to stop. Willow Run, Michigan, August 1942. A cornfield is learning a new language. In one summer, it has acquired a mile-long roofline rail, sidings like vanes and doors tall enough for an airplane to be born and leave in the same breath. Inside, the air smells of cutting oil and fresh paint. Chalk lines run across a concrete ocean where stations are numbered instead of named. The United States is attempting a theological rewrite to make a heavy bomber not as a sculpture, but as a flow. The conversion didn't start with a blueprint. It started with a refusal. We cannot build rare things, one manager says, staring at a wall covered in spaghetti drawings that would make sense to 3 experts and nobody else. The war does not care about rare. It wants tempo. So the team begins in the unglamorous places: how a worker stands, how far a hand reaches, where a rivet gun rests between pulls. They turn human motion into geometry. If an operation forces a mechanic to twist, the fixture rotates instead. If a harness snakes through ribs, the harness gets built on a board flat and obvious, then draped into a fuselage section before the section ever sees the main line. August becomes September, and the mock-ups multiply plywood ghosts of future stations. Engineers stop arguing with machinists and start co-designing with them. A wing is not a wing anymore. It is ribs, spars, skins, systems, each with a takt time written in chalk. The old catechism, get it perfect, then repeat, is replaced by a harder one, get it repeatable, then perfect within it. Deviations are hunted not by inspectors with red pencils, but by fixtures that simply refuse to accept a bad part. Some discoveries feel like magic because they're so simple. Pre-stuffing: take a fuselage barrel off the main line, crowd it with electricians and pipe fitters in its own world, and return it complete so riveters aren't dancing with anyone. Kitting: no more treasure hunts for fasteners. Each station receives a shadowed tray whose emptiness screams when a step is missed. Color codes: oxygen lines cannot hide among hydraulics when they wear different paint. Torque marks a single swipe of lacquer that turns an abstract spec into a glanceable truth. The line itself learns to breathe. Early stoppages are humiliating and useful. A crane fails. The whole building holds its breath. Lesson learned: build redundancy. A batch of skins arrives with holes that want to disagree with the jig. The fix doesn't live at the station, it lives in the drawing and the tool. A charismatic foreman saves a late job by bending a rule. The postmortem writes that rule bigger on the wall. Heroics are replaced by systems because heroics do not scale. The human side of the conversion is just as radical. Thousands of new workers arrive from farms, shops, kitchens, classrooms. They don't come to apprentice for years. They come to become productive this week. So the plant teaches with artifacts. A good part and a bad part sit side by side at every station. Hands learn by touching both. Visual standards replace whispered lore. A 19-year-old can string a complex loom because the harness board remembers the route, so she doesn't have to. Pride shifts from personal virtuosity to team rhythm. When the lamp above Station 24 goes green on time, the whole row smiles. By winter, the factory speaks in numbers, and those numbers mean something. Queue lengths shrink. First time fit climbs. Scrap falls not because people work harder, but because the work is redesigned to be hard to do wrong. The most beautiful sentence you can overhear is the quiet, unhurried next, as a completed subassembly rolls to a yellow line that knows where it must be at 10:20. There is still romance in the building it just moved. You can feel it when a newly mated fuselage and wing settle on their gear for the first time, and a cheer rises that isn't about one airplane. It's about a promise kept. The calendar has become a weapon. The door at the far wall, that tall rectangle of daylight, has become the final station of a choreography that starts with oar and ends with contrails. Willow Run is not the only place this happens, but it is where the idea declares itself without apology. The country discovers that you can pour craft into a tool, poor judgment, into a gauge, poor experience, into a work instruction that a stranger can succeed with on their first day. It is not a betrayal of quality. It is quality tamed and multiplied. It is the impossible idea made ordinary enough to run on a night shift. On a clipboard in the mezzanine, someone writes the plant's daily rate and underlines it twice. The number isn't a boast. It's a promise to a crew already taxiing in the rain 2,000 miles away. The factory bows to the runway, and the runway bows back. That is what the conversion really means. Numbers, then, because the war is decided in numbers, the way tides decide a shoreline. First rhythm. A handcrafted fighter built in a prestige shop might leave the far wall in dozens per month. A heavy bomber assembled in a flow plant aims at hundreds per month. The axis can point to exquisite engines whose birth demands watchmaker patience. The Allied line points to a schedule where every station owes minutes, not moods. The ratio that matters is not performance on a test card, but output per calendar day. When you array the columns, the comparison is brutal. A craft-first cell repeats its labor. A flow-first system repeats its learning. Second, tact. In the craft model, tact time is folklore. It changes with who shows up and how stubborn the metal is. In the flow model, tact time is contract. If the line must advance every 55 minutes, every upstream choice is judged against 55. Tool changes, crane travel, cure cycles, inspection gates, all are retimed or redesigned until they fit the drumbeat. The result isn't just speed, it's predictability. Predictability lets railroads and depots preload the next week instead of apologizing for the last one. Third, cost per usable hour. A masterpiece that costs less per unit on paper, but requires heroics to service in the field, is lying to you. The flow system attacks lifetime cost by attacking variation. Interchangeable parts mean field maintenance becomes swap torque sign. Training hours at the front collapse because procedures are the same in Arizona and in Norfolk. The Axis spends precious time saving precious machines. The Allies spend ordinary time sustaining ordinary machines and then bury the enemy under the difference. Fourth, defect economics. In craft, a defect discovered late invites genius. Somebody files and shims and makes it work. In flow, a defect discovered late is a disaster, so the system makes late rare. Error-proofing is baked in gauges that won't close on bad dimensions. Fixtures that refuse to accept misdrilled skins. Go, no-go pins that turn an abstract tolerance into a binary truth. The ratio here is staggering. One caught at the source defect prevents dozens of downstream contortions and hundreds of field headaches. Scrap curves, bend, rework hours vanish, capacity reappears without building a new plant. Fifth, design for manufacture. The Allied secret isn't only stations and schedules, it's the humility to change designs so stations and schedules can win. 5 setup brackets become 2 setup brackets. Odd fasteners are exiled. Access doors proliferate where maintenance used to pray. The Axis reply, but the performance misses the point. A 1% technical edge that strangles rate is an edge that feeds the other side's calendar. In the table of war, rate multiplies performance. A good airplane delivered now beats a slightly better airplane delivered when the weather clears, finally compounding. Output behaves like interest. If you can hold a high rate for 6 months, you don't just get a big fleet. You get spare parts poured through the same pipes, you get schools running without starving squadrons, you get the luxury to rotate crews and still fly today's tasking. The Axis measures brilliance per unit. The Allies measure brilliance per month. That is the strategic key, a system that can be pushed without breaking, gives commanders choices that no amount of individual excellence can counterfeit. So the chart that matters, the one that sits on the war room wall, is simple units accepted by date. It is not a moral document. It is physics turned into ink. Where craft reigns, the line wobbles and plateaus. Where flow reigns, the line climbs, then steadies into a shelf you can fight a war from. Behind that line sits the secret sauce that isn't secret at all, fixtures that remember gauges that don't lie, drawings that obey the factory logistics that show up, and leadership that understands that quality. At rate is not a compromise. It is the strategy. East Anglia, England, February 1944. Dawn wears a white breath over hard runways as crew chiefs slap cowlings and starters whine. The board in Group Ops reads like a dare big week. The target set is not a city or a bridge, but an industry, the Luftwaffe's lungs. This is where the impossible idea must leave the factory and prove itself in the sky. The taxiway becomes a moving rail line. B-17s and B-24s nose-to-tail yellow prop tips strobing run-up checks in a choreography that looks rehearsed because it is. The numbers no longer live on a mezzanine clipboard. They live in the air, 3 divisions, hundreds of heavies, escorts, stacked in altitudes like mezzanines of protection. The armorers have already fed the bellies. The weather officer has already negotiated with the clouds. There is no romance left to invent. Only rate to execute. Takeoff is a drumbeat. Wheels leave concrete tuck, and the aircraft climb into lanes of sky marked only by contrails and doctrine. The formation assembles not as a miracle of piloting, but as a manifestation of planning timings that assume the line can deliver both quantity and sameness. The radio is busy and calm. When a ship aborts for a supercharger hiccup, a spare slides into the slot, like a component on a well-timed conveyor. That is the system's signature. No single failure distorts the rhythm. Over the continent, flak fields bloom. Black puffs sketch the bomber's path for anyone who wants to kill them. Fighters rise to the scent, and for minutes, the sky is a geometry problem solved at 400 miles per hour. But the escorts are there because the factory could feed both spear and shield. P-47s dive in, P-51s climb out and roll back down, and the bombers hold course inside boxes designed to survive the first cuts. The enemy's courage is not in question. His capacity is. Bomb doors open on cues. Factories framed in Norden crosshairs look deceptively small until the first sticks of bombs stabilize the scale. Oil plants, assembly halls, rail junctions. Each target is a valve in a larger machine, and valves that don't open choke engines downstream. The headlines will name cities. The shop floor will recognize parts, machining centers that won't spin, heat treat ovens that won't harden, dyno cells that won't light. Losses come, the war charges, interest up front, but the ledger looks different now. A squadron that lands short today does not end tomorrow's plan. Replacement aircraft, replacement. Crews, replacement, everything lagoon. Behind the mission, pushed forward by a continental supply chain that thinks in week-long tides, not in heroic last-minute miracles. Maintenance turns airplanes overnight because the airplanes were built to be turned access panels where hands need them. Standardized hardware engines that come off with a handful of fasteners and a hoist. By June, the same arithmetic lands at the channel. Normandy isn't a secret. It's a schedule. The sky becomes a system of lanes, fighter sweeps, at dawn, mediums, at mid-morning, heavies, at altitude, erasing rail, choke points, fighter bombers in the afternoon, cutting anything that looks like a convoy. Quantity stops being an abstraction and becomes a weather pattern. If one bridge survives a morning wave, it meets an afternoon one. If a depot rescues rolling stock by spreading it out, it learns what dispersion looks like under a sky that refuses to run out of ordnance. The men on the ground feel the difference in tempo. Engineers get steel when they ask for it. Quartermasters get spare tires and spark plugs and aviation gas without bargaining with fate. Airfields soak up new groups without starving old ones. When a field telephone rings with the next day's tasking, nobody wonders whether there will be airplanes to fly it. In briefings, the tense jokes change grammar from "if we make it back" to "who's taking the second go." The enemy is still dangerous. There are days when clouds own the air, and nights when flak feels sentient. There are missions that come home on 3 engines and prayers. But the trial by fire is not whether one airplane can win a duel. It is whether a system can remain on cadence while under fire. And it does. The cue for that truth is subtle. The sound after midnight, when the last ship taxis in, and instead of silence, the field hums, because the line behind the line is already at work, refueling, bomb loading, swapping engines, logging snags, ordering parts that will arrive because trains somewhere inland have been moving for days to make this night ordinary. By late 1944, the calendar itself has become a weapon, the way a bomb once was. Operations plan with confidence that tomorrow's strength will look like today's minus combat losses already accounted for and replaced. That is what the trial proves. The factory didn't just build airplanes. It built assurance. And assurance is how you cross a continent. The recognition doesn't arrive as a speech. It arrives as a feeling. A ground crewman watches contrails at noon and knows there will be more at 3. A city siren wails not once but many times in a day until it becomes background. A commander flips through claims that should make him proud and discovers an ache the map hasn't moved. Victories that once shifted fronts now by an afternoon. In briefing rooms, the chalk squeaks the same algebra. 2 Gruppen will climb here, 1 will faint there. Commit on the first box. The plan is good. The pilots are good. The problem is the sky's depth. You break the first wave and the second wave arrives with fresh escorts. You climb to hit the heavies and P-51s fall through you like coins dropped from a balcony. Your best men are dying faster than your schools can refill their seats, not because they lack skill, but because they cannot punch holes in an ocean. On the factory floor, the humiliation has a different shape. The departments that once prided themselves on artistry now live under a siren of deadlines that never had to be real before. Inspectors sign off with a speed they don't trust. Rework stations overflow. A foreman stares at a pile of parts that do not match jigs and knows the jig won't change, the drawing must. And changing the drawing requires a committee that is hiding in a shelter. Precision without pace curdles into a sickness perfection that arrives late. The raids find the soft organs. Oil always oil is a wound that won't clot. When hydrogenation plants stop, engines stop. When ball-bearing factories pause, everything with a shaft groans. Dispersal buys days. It does not buy capacity. The railways thread around craters until the next bombardment redraws the map of what around means. Each fix spawns a new fragility. You can feel the truth in the way mechanics strip one aircraft to save another and call victory what used to be triage. At squadron level, the realization sounds like silence, where chatter used to be. The radio discipline that once felt like poise becomes a thinness. You run out of the veterans who used to save a bounce by smelling it, out of the section leaders who could turn a bad merge into a lesson instead of a funeral. Replacement pilots have courage and flight hours on paper. They do not have time. Time is what the other side hoarded in plants and depots and training pipelines. Time is what their numbers purchase every day. Strategically, the terror is not the raid you're watching. It's the certainty that tomorrow will look the same. Attrition is no longer a curve you can bend with a lucky month or a clever tactic. It is a slope set by the opponent's calendar. You shoot down 12 and listen to reconnaissance report 40 rolling out of a factory you cannot reach anymore, because it is inland or underground, or guarded by so many fighters that your loss column would bankrupt your wing. Men who once laughed at crude rivet lines and big access panels write different adjectives in their diaries: relentless, plentiful, impossible to exhaust. They still win duels. They still take pride in a perfect gunnery pass. They still love their machines, but love does not refill a fuel dump bombed every other night. Pride does not conjure ball bearings. Courage does not teach a 19-year-old what only repetition can teach him. The realization crystallizes in a single battlefield truth whispered from trench to headquarters: we are being outlasted. Not outbraved, not outflown, outlasted. The war has become a contest of who can keep showing up, and the enemy has turned showing up into an industry. When officers once spoke of decisive battles, they meant hours that would decide years. Now the decisive instrument is the year itself, its weeks, its trains, its factories that do not sleep. That is the horror, discovering that the machine you mocked does not tire. and that every day you fight it, you feed it the only thing it needed from you: time. Wars end not when arguments are won, but when calendars are conquered. By late 1944, the decisive variable is no longer whose airplane climbs a little faster or whose cannon throws a shell a little flatter. The decisive variable is how many machines can be delivered, sustained, and replaced while still fighting today's tasking. In that arithmetic, the Axis advantage in craftsmanship becomes a liability beauty that arrives late, lethality that comes in singles where the battle demands streams. Production is strategy when it controls tempo. Allied lines stabilize at rates that lock in operational choices. There will be bombers every morning, fighters in every altitude band, transports to feed the next landing, trainers to refill the squadrons, spares to keep the whole organism breathing. Commanders begin to plan in depth, not for one blow, but for a sequence of blows that overlap and interlock, each enabled by the certainty that tomorrow's strength will look like today's. That certainty is not luck. It is the dividend of interchangeable parts, fixtures that don't forget, drawings that obey the plant, and rail schedules that run like arteries. Technical excellence, when it cannot be multiplied, is relegated to the margins. A clever supercharger sculpted by masters cannot rescue a sortie if the refinery that feeds it is ash by noon. A superb fighter cannot tame the sky if its pilots rotate faster into cemeteries than schools. Even the most intimidating armored battalion needs fuel tracks, bearings, things made by the thousand, not by the hush of a bench. The Allied system understood this brutal ecology and fed it without romance. If a unit can be standardized, it will be. If a task can be parallelized, it must be. If a tolerance is tighter than reality needs, it loosens to liberate rate. Attrition under these conditions changes sides. The Luftwaffe, once a predator, becomes prey to arithmetic. Tactical victories burn through irreplaceable veterans. Operational losses. Depots, rail, choke points, ball-bearing plants, hydrogenation facilities shrink the lungs of the war economy. Strategic bombing, often debated for its moral and statistical fog, imposes one crystal truth: capacity declines faster than tactics can compensate. Meanwhile, Allied capacity compounds. A month at high rate begets spares, begets training hours, begets rested crews, begets confidence, the quiet force multiplier that lets leaders accept risk without inviting collapse. On the ground, the same logic rolls like weather. Artillery shoots more and moves more because trucks are not museum pieces, but consumables that can be replaced. Engineers throw bridges at a pace that defeats demolition. Infantry divisions receive shoes, radios, rations, and replacements on time, often enough that on time becomes the culture. When logistics is normal, maneuver becomes art again. When logistics is rare, maneuver is theater played to empty seats. Thus the Axis finds its celebrated advantages sealed inside glass. Precision is still admired. Certain airframes and guns still terrify in the narrow frames where they appear. But the war has widened beyond those frames. It is an industrial duel, and in that duel, the side that turned time into a machine wins the right to decide when battles happen, how long they last, and what tomorrow looks like if today goes badly. That right is the definition of strategy. In the last winter, as front lines collapse in sections rather than neat arcs, the cause is less mysterious than post-war memoirs sometimes pretend. The production gap has grown into a behavior gap. One military can recover from shocks because its factories and depots are designed for shock. The other cannot because its brilliance is embedded in fragile rituals that shatter under constant pounding. The verdict is not sentimental. It is a ledger closed by men with grease under their nails and pencils behind their ears. Quantity at rate made quality decisive by making it common. After the shooting stops, confessions travel faster than they did in briefings. In quiet rooms, Axis officials speak a language they once refused to hear. Albert Speer, an engineer's engineer, admits in essence that his ministry was outpaced by an opponent who standardized judgment. The Americans, he notes, designed so factories could win. We designed so craftsmen could. Our corrections ran sideways as rework. Theirs ran upstream into drawings and tools. They built the conditions for success, he concedes in paraphrase, not just the machines. Air officers reading loss graphs that never bent the way their tactics promised offer a similar refrain. We fought skill with skill, one reflects years later, but they fought skill with supply. Pilots could win engagements. They could not win the calendar. Victories felt real in the cockpit and abstract on the map. The next day's contrails made the abstraction real again. Even Hermann Göring, who once dismissed the American 50,000 plane pledge as fantasy faces, numbers that make the word small. The fantasy materialized into annual outputs near 100,000 bombers, fighters, trainers, transports. The lesson distilled is less about one airplane than about a system that could birth and sustain many. Quality was not abandoned. It was disciplined by fixtures, gauges, and schedules until it could survive volume. These are not poetic regrets. They are professional ones' acknowledgments that a modern war is a contest of reproducibility. The side that can make excellence ordinary wins, not because it discovers a miracle, but because it refuses to depend on one. When the ledgers close and the presses go quiet, the final word fits on a small line at the bottom of a large page. The machine that keeps showing up decides the war.